Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Here we are with the last of the biogeochemical cycles. This is the nitrogen cycle, which, as I mentioned last time, is probably going to be kind of confusing, mostly just due to the terminology. All right, but on the plus side, we're going to have a bunch of pictures. Hopefully, that'll help narrow things down, make sense of things. Let's take a look at the basics. Nitrogen makes up 78% of the atmosphere and is an important nutrient for all living organisms. You need it to live, is what I'm saying, and it's all around you at all times. Every time you breathe in, it's mostly nitrogen. Yet despite swimming in an ocean of nitrogen, we can't use it unless it is combined with oxygen to make nitrate. Okay, well that seems problematic, but not the end of the world because, oxygen's in the air too, right? So the nitrogen and the oxygen, they'll just mix together, problem solved. Changing of nitrogen to nitrates and back is called the nitrogen cycle. And unfortunately, it will not involve just mixing oxygen and nitrogen together and calling it a day. I know. All right, here you can see half the diagram for the nitrogen cycle. I told you this is complicated, so we're keeping it simple. Over here, we've got nitrogen fixation. This is the first big step. The second big step is denitrification. Now, D means like anti or stop or don't do or like undo. So it's like undo the creation of nitrogen or nitrates specifically. Over here, we are fixing, which is an old-fashioned way to say like pin it or nail it to the ground. So nitrogen fixation takes the nitrogen from up here and sticks it in the ground, whereas denitrification takes the nitrogen that's in the ground and puts it back in the air. That part seems pretty straightforward. The names are a little bit weird. It's kind of strange we didn't call this the loosening thing or something or like that. I don't know. Don't look at me. I didn't get to name it. But living things complicate this, okay? So here's the other half of the picture, right? As it says here, other living things will intrude on this simple cycle by consuming the nitrates. Some will turn ammonia into nitrate while others the reverse. Why is ammonia coming into this? Well, when nitrogen fixation happens, which was like in this area here, see here's the two blue arrows. When I pin the nitrogen to the ground, some of it just immediately becomes nitrate, in which case it can skip this purple arrow step right here. The stuff that becomes nitrate just immediately gets picked up by plants and then picked up by animals in turn, no problem. But sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes particular bacteria will make ammonia instead, because ammonia is a common waste product of living things and bacteria are alive. So ammonia will get turned by other bacteria into nitrates through the process of nitrification, which is number 3 right here. So nitrification turns ammonia at this stage into nitrates down here. Once it turns into nitrates, life happens. That's the green arrows. So the nitrates will get picked up by plants, and then the plants will get eaten by animals. Here's the legs of the cow. Or maybe they'll immediately go into some other bacteria somewhere else. No big deal. But life happens. Very complicated, very messy, but not a huge deal for us. Eventually, though, life will do one of two things. Either it'll die and start to decay, or if it's an animal, it might defecate, aka poop. When the cow that was right here ends up pooping, it ends up releasing those nitrates. Those nitrates then get consumed by bacteria and turned back into ammonia before once again being turned into nitrates again by something else. Or maybe they don't get turned back into nitrates. Maybe they just immediately leave. Either way, that's ammonification, which is step 4 here. Okay, so let's put this all back together again. Here we go. There's the whole thing. So we start off in the air. We fix the nitrogen to the ground. Boom. Once it's attached, some of it immediately enters the life cycle, so it skips this purple arrow. Some of it, though, has to be turned from ammonia into nitrates through nitrification. Once that happens, life occurs. Plants pick it up, animals eat the plants, animals will then defecate or decay, then they will release ammonia back into the system through ammonification. That might cycle around over and over again. There's nothing stopping this from just going in a big circle, right? That's the idea behind using animal feces as chemical fertilizer. But then, eventually, it might turn back into nitrogen in the air through some other bacteria which do denitrification. And that's it. It's a cycle with a couple extra steps, right? Like if everything just immediately got turned into nitrate, we wouldn't need this purple step here. That would make things a little easier. And if things here never got turned back into ammonia, then we wouldn't need the red arrow there. So there are a couple little like, okay, it makes it a little bit more difficult, but it's not the end of the world. Here's a simple cycle. So we start with nitrogen up here in the air, and then it's going to nitrify, or fix, I should say, into nitrates and ammonias down here. Then it gets picked up by plants. Now those plants could be eaten by an animal of some form, whatever, or this animal itself could die. Either way, all of these nitrates eventually leave life and come back over here into denitrification, which eventually turns it back into nitrogen again. Okay, so here's the 4 different steps mapped onto this. Okay, we got our nitrogen fixation over here. Over here, we're going to get our nitrification, where we turn ammonia into nitrate. This is being alive. Pretty straightforward. Up here, we've got ammonification, where we turn nitrates back into ammonia. And then finally, we've got denitrification, where we turn all those nitrates back into nitrogen. Okay, so it's just one big cycle with like a little side tangent for being alive. Yeah, you're being alive, side tangent. Okay, I know it's a lot. The language is a lot. There's a lot of words here. Plus, I mean, you see now, there's 3 different types of nitrogen fixing. What's going on with that? I didn't say anything about that. I'm going to do that now. Okay, there are 3 ways to fix nitrogen, just to make this harder. The first one is biological, the second one is electrical, and the third one is chemical. Each of these pictures represents that. We'll see what each one is in just a second. Let's take a look at biological first. So biological nitrogen fixation. So remember, nitrogen fixation is going from nitrogen in the air down into the soil. Okay, and what does that mean? Bacteria in the soil change the nitrogen to ammonia. Other bacteria that grow in the roots of certain plants can change the nitrogen to ammonia or into NO3, nitrate, through nitrification. So basically there are a couple different steps, but the first one is the nitrogen in the air, we can't do anything with it, but there are some types of bacteria that can. So what happens is that bacteria ends up absorbing the nitrogen from the air, turns it into ammonia, basically it pees it out. Other bacteria then pick that up and turn it into nitrates. The plants need those nitrates. So it turns out that these bacteria here have managed to come up with this nice teamwork kind of thing going on here, right? So the bacteria grow with the roots of the plant. The plant protects the bacteria and provides it with other foods and other things it needs. And in turn, the bacteria helps the plants grow. Not every plant has this. Legumes are a very common one, so like peas and beans and stuff. But there are other types of plants that do this as well, like alfalfa is a pretty big one. Clover, that's another one. So this is sort of the, we'll say, sustainable way to do this, right? Because it's the balance that's already been built into an ecosystem at the start. But there are other options. Lightning. The energy from lightning causes nitrogen gas to react with oxygen in the air, producing nitrates directly, skipping the nitrification steps. You don't have to turn the ammonia into nitrates anymore because it's just boom, nitrates. Well, so remember I said, right, there's nitrogen in the air and we breathe it in all the time, but we can't break it down. We breathe it in, we breathe it out immediately. It doesn't really do anything. The reason we can't break it down is actually very simple. A nitrogen, you guys may remember, is bonded with 3 bonds, right? We've seen this before. So here's 2 nitrates. This is a diatomic molecule. So it's going to have 5 electrons because it's in that particular family. I know it's been a long time since we had to do one of these diagrams. And these guys are going to share. So these 2 are going to share, these 2 are going to share, and these 2 are going to share. This is a triple bond. Triple bonds are really strong because there's like 3 things holding on to each other. Pulling that apart takes a lot of energy. How much energy? Direct hit with lightning. Direct. So the only 2 ways for most of human existence that we could create nitrates were certain kinds of bacteria found in certain plants, or get Thor, the god of thunder, to blast parts of the sky. That's it. Those are the only 2 ways that we can make nitrates for most of human existence. One of those is slightly more plausible than the other one. This is a very strong bond. Lightning is a lot of power, but this is hard to break. That's why, despite the fact that we can breathe in nitrogen, we can't make any nitrates out of it. Why do we need nitrates? Well, because if it's in this form, we can't do anything with it. But if it's mixed with oxygen, reminder, a nitrate looks something like this. This, our bodies can break down. This, we could pull the oxygens apart. We can get at that nitrogen that we need. Why do we need nitrogen? Well, a lot of your cells and a bunch of the different processes that make you, live require nitrogen to work. So we need to get it from somewhere. Now, there was a third one there, chemical, with a guy's face. I said, for most of human history, most isn't all. What's the next one? As you can see here, it's not easy to do. This process is called the Haber process, and it was developed by that chap whose picture I showed you, a guy called Haber. And he was able to figure out how to create nitrates, well, okay, not nitrates, ammonia specifically, from nitrogen in the atmosphere. It's a multi-step process that involves at least, how many we got here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different chemical reactions minimum, along with a range of different treatments and heaters and reactors and cooling stations and tons of other stuff. He figured this out in the 1910s or so about 100 years ago. Yeah. It was a big deal. He got a Nobel Prize for it. Admittedly, there was an awful lot of unease about giving him a Nobel Prize because Haber also invented chemical weapons, which were used in the First World War. And it was one of those, well, he made weapons that are incredibly damaging and scarring to people and unleashed horrors unimaginable, but he also ensured that all of us could produce fertilizer in a factory. So they gave him a Nobel Prize, but there was a lot of protest around it. Let's put it that way. It was a big deal. This is hard to overstate. Before this process, and the reason he invented this process was because during the war, Germany was cut off from the shipments of guano, which is bat poop, that were coming from South America, which was used as a fertilizer in most farms. Animal manure has a lot of nitrates in it. We eat different kinds of plants. We use some of the nitrates, but not all of them. And then we poop out the rest of the nitrates, and we pee out ammonia. So all the different nitrates are there. But there wasn't really enough animal waste or human waste to really grow enough food, because, well, most of us don't go poop in a field. So we used to import bat guano and other animal feces from other parts of the world. Yes, that was actually a thing you could export make money as a country. You could export poop to other countries that needed more poop to grow things. But during the war, the British decided to blockade Germany, to starve them of any kind of food. The hope being that, if everybody was starving, they'd stop fighting. So this resulted in quite a few famines and things. But then Haber, being the incredibly clever guy that he is, figured out a way to make artificial fertilizer. So it allowed the war to keep going. Yay! But then, after the war, it allowed that idea to be shared across all of humanity, and now we can grow food very well. Very, very well. We no longer have the same problems or constraints on ourselves that we used to have when it came to being able to grow food. So that's a plus. Longer World War I, that's a negative, so it kind of evens out in the end, I guess. I don't know. Depends how you want to look at it. Turns out that history is complicated, as are people. What can I say? But this, as complicated as it is incredibly useful. Okay, so bringing this back to the summary, remember this? We got our 3 options. We got the legume or biological nitrogen fixation. We got the electrical nitrogen fixation caused by lightning. Yes, you could do it by just creating enough power yourself through electricity, but it's not as efficient as the Haber process over here with the industrial nitrogen fixation. The trick is just making sure you can do it. So there you go. That is the cycle. Now, again, the hardest part is going to be the names. You fix nitrogen into the ground. Okay, so like nitrogen's floating in the air and you're going to fix it. You're going to nail it to the ground. So you fix it. Then any ammonia gets turned into nitrates. So that's nitrification. I am creating nitrate, right? Fication means like create or do. So I'm creating nitrates. Then living happens. Finally, you got ammonification, because all that poop and pee that we release, the nitrates get broken down into ammonia. Finally, denitrification, the opposite of creating nitrates, puts those nitrates back into the air. The only way this could be better is if it was a little more symmetric, right? Where like the green one over here and the red one here, because they are the opposites of each other. If only those had the same names and these had the same names. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in, because as we've discussed, scientists are bad at naming things. But there you go. Those are the 4 steps. Just try to make sure you keep them straight. So what does this all mean? Well, plants use nitrates to grow. We've already established that. And when plants die and decay, they release that nitrates back in the soil, allowing new plants to then grow. Okay, pretty straightforward. Animals can eat the plants, taking those nitrates in, but animal waste is rich in nitrates, and so it helps restore the ecosystem. This is a sustainable ecosystem, a sustainable cycle. Why? Because it'll keep going forever. So long as you got plants growing and animals pooping, everything will be fine. But, as always, humans interfere. When humans farm, they grow plants, but they harvest them, and then those harvests are sent to the city. This takes the nitrates from the ecosystem where they were originally grown, and then the human waste is rarely returned to the same place. This disrupts the cycling of nitrates and is, as a result, unsustainable. Thus, to retain soil fertility, humans have to restore the nitrates through fertilizers and other techniques. What type of techniques? Well, okay, the first one, maintaining nitrate levels is pretty important. As I mentioned, right, agriculture is one of the biggest experiments that we've ever done. It's huge and it's incredibly important because, as we talked about way at the start of this whole thing, we're top predators. We need a lot of food. Farming proved to be a pretty easy way to get it, but we have to maintain the level of nitrates in the soil. Originally, we didn't do this, historically speaking. Like when we first figured out farming, we were like, this is amazing. You plant seeds in the same place every year and then they grow and you eat them. It's awesome. But over time, the areas where we were farming got less and less fertile. Over time, the plants were a little bit shorter. They were a little bit less. So the crop yields, the amount of food we got, was less and less and less and less and less. And so now many of the first places that we did farming are no longer that great because we've kind of used them up. The original locations that we figured out farming were the Middle East, in what is known as the Fertile Crescent, Egypt, the Nile Valley, and the Indus River Valley in India. Those are the 3 places that we were able to figure out farming initially. China also picked it up there, northern Chinese plain. But those are the first 3 that we've managed to get records for and we find archaeological evidence for. But the Middle East is not nearly as fertile as it used to be. Egypt is doing okay still, but not as great as it was. It's from over farming and because we didn't know that was a problem originally. So the first way that you maintain nitrate levels is you do absolutely nothing. This is the default technique of early agriculture. Over the centuries, it left the soil in some areas nearly barren for growing crops. This leads to things like desertification, although not exactly. Now, each one of those 3 areas that I mentioned has a different reason why they're having a hard time. In the case of the Fertile Crescent, it was just over-farming without the ability to replenish nitrates. In the case of the Nile didn't have that much problem because the Nile flooded on a regular basis. But it doesn't flood anymore because we put dams on it to generate electricity. And without the flooding, the land around the Nile doesn't get regenerated every year. So we got electricity, but now we can't grow food. That said, generally speaking, Egypt imports a lot of food these days instead because it's mostly desert. All right, so obviously we'll call this level 0. Now we're going to go up to level 1. Boom! Summer fallow. Cropland that is purposely kept out of production during the regular growing season. Resting the ground in this manner allows other plants to grow, die, and decay, restoring the nitrates to the soil. It still results in slow loss of soil fertility. It just takes longer. Okay, so what you're basically doing there is that the farmers, they didn't really know why. Right? Like all this stuff about nitrate requires you to understand chemistry. Farmers, thousands of years ago, they didn't know what chemistry was. So they just said, okay, look, if I grow crops every single year, I get less and less and less and less. And it's very subtle, right? Like it's really slow. It's one of those like, my father told me that we used to make a lot more food from this. So some clever people managed to figure out that that wasn't the only way to do this. Instead, they realized, oh, okay, wait. If I don't grow anything one year in a particular field, next year I'll get a little bit more. So instead of it like coming down like this, they kind of figured out they could do this, like do, 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 do. Now you'll notice my hand is still mostly going down. Now why is that? Well, when you allow other things to grow and to regenerate the soil, they're not replacing the nitrates that the humans removed by harvesting the crops, eating them, and then walking away, right? We take the nitrates, we eat them, we put them in our body, and then we leave, right? People don't just live in fields. So any nitrate that we consumed would leave with us. So the only way you're going to keep 100% of the fertility of the soil is if you were to plant and bring in some other kind of plants that could regenerate the nitrates faster than they normally would have. So this is a level 1, right? We've gotten better than doing nothing, but this is still just level 1. So we need to do more. Now, as I mentioned, right, one of those things is you can add fertilizer. And one of the initial fertilizers was animal waste, because while we consume nitrates, we don't use all of them. So animal waste from us or dogs or cats or pigs or cows or whatever could be used to supplement this. But again, it's got to be balancing out there. You got to get enough. Okay, what's level 2 now? Crop rotation. Rotating which crop you grow each year. Rotation is between plants that need nitrogen and legumes that make nitrogen. Okay, reminder, it's biological fixation. It's not the legumes that do it, it's the bacteria, but it doesn't matter. Point is, you rotate. So instead of planting the same thing every year, you rotate which things you plant. And by putting other things in the ground, in the field, one year you'll use up some, another year you'll put some back. See, so now you're doing this and you're staying within the same area. So it keeps the fertility of the soil, but there's still a downside. You retain soil fertility, but not everyone wants beans, so farmers can't earn as much money. Right? Like if you're on the I'm going to plant soybeans this year crop and not everyone wants soybeans, then you're like, well, I got a bunch of soybeans. Anyone want to buy them? And everyone's like, no, I'm good. I'm going to go to Farmer Bob down the road and grab some corn because I like corn more than soybeans. And you're like, next year I'm planting corn. This year I'm not going to make as much money, I guess. It's a bit of a tension there because you're like, well, maybe I should just not plant the soybeans this year. I mean, I need the extra cash. And then you get out of this pattern and then the fields start to go down again. It's a challenge. So this is what we were doing. We figured this out in the Middle Ages and we started doing this around then, and it was working pretty well. This plus, of course, animal waste, fertilizers, all of that worked pretty okay. But as I mentioned, there's a downside. So that's our level 2. So now we're going to get to level 3, right? We're going to max it out. What did we figure out? Well, as mentioned, we can use fertilizers. Chemistry produces nitrate fertilizers from other materials, restoring the land. This sort of has the best of all the options. A, I keep the fertility high. B, I can keep growing whatever will make me decent money so I don't have to waste a year. Where's the downside, right? I mean, look, I just drive a tractor and spray and everything's amazing. Okay, there are downsides. Remember, one of the rules of this whole course, this whole unit, is that ecosystems are complicated. Yeah, this looks super simple, but it's not. There's something more to understand here. Remember, nitrates are hard to get. We said there are 3 ways to do it. Specific bacteria, lightning, and chemistry that we only figured out 100 years ago when we've been doing stuff for like a couple millennia at this point. None of those are easy. But pouring stuff on the field, well, that's actually pretty simple. And that's a problem. Normally, nitrates are hard to get, but with chemical fertilizers, this is no longer the case. This can lead to an excess of plants, which can have a harmful effect on lakes and rivers. Bodies of water containing an excess, that means too much, of nitrates and ammonia have frequent algae blooms. Grand Beach, near us, has that all the time. If you haven't heard of Grand Beach, I wouldn't be surprised. Back during my parents' generation, Grand Beach was world famous as one of the nicest beaches in the world. Well, as world famous as a beach can be in the middle of Canada. Anyway, Grand Beach is awesome because the currents of the lake and everything happen to arrange it perfectly, so that way you end up with this incredibly long, shallow beach. It goes way into the lake itself, and you can walk, and it goes like up to your waist kind of thing, and as a result the water's very warm, and you can run and play and swim, and it's very safe. It was a wonderful beach, and now it's not so wonderful because of this. You'll see why in just a second. I got some pictures. So the excessive weed beds and other things that are growing because there's so much nitrates, the plants are like, oh, sweet, there's so much, we can just grow like crazy, because normally they can't. The blooms can produce dangerous toxins themselves, which can harm fish and wildlife in the ecosystem. They can also do other things when they die. But let me show you what it looks like. There you go. That is an algal bloom, and it's not great. Eventually, the blooms will crash, and the algae will begin to die. Why do they crash? Well, so eventually they run out of nitrates, because it turns out that we don't tend to pour fertilizer onto fields when it's winter. So in the winter, these guys all die. And when they all die at once, well, they have to rot. And the process of decay is cellular respiration, right? It's bacteria consuming something. That takes oxygen. So what this does is that the process of rotting sucks all the oxygen out of the water and uses it to decay the plants. I got a little thing to do about the fish. Well, let's finish this here. The decomposing weeds and algae deplete oxygen from the water, which causes fish to die due to lack of oxygen. So there you go. I just said that. A friend of mine told a story, right? They were cleaning their fish tank, and they'd taken all the fish out of the fish tank, and they put them in a bucket. But then they went to the store to get some more of something they needed for the cleaning of the fish tank, and when they came back, a bunch of the fish had jumped out of the bucket and were sitting on the carpet. And they were, of course, dead, because fish can't breathe air. But the fish in the bucket that stayed there were also dead. And they're like, what happened? The answer is, unfortunately, very simple. We think of fish being able to breathe water, but they don't. They're living organisms. They do cellular respiration, which requires oxygen. So they just get their oxygen out of the water. We get it out of the air. Our lungs are capable of filtering the oxygen out of the carbon dioxide and nitrogen that makes up the bulk of the atmosphere. The gills of a fish allow them to filter oxygen out of the medium of water. That oxygen is dissolved in between the water molecules. But when the fish were stuck in the tiny bucket, they ran out of oxygen in the bucket. They used it all. And you might go, whoa, wait, but why didn't that happen in the fish tank? And isn't there oxygen in the air? Couldn't it have, like, dissolved or something? Yeah, but unfortunately, dissolving at the surface of water when the water isn't moving is really hard. The water acts like a barrier. The reason why a fish tank has that little bubbling machine, that puts bubbles away, is to help break up the water surface and to help oxygen come in to the water. Without it, the oxygen is depleted very quickly. In nature, this happens all the time because there are streams and lakes and rivers and things are moving all the time, and there are plants, and those plants also produce oxygen directly in the water. So there are lots of different things that help to regenerate the water itself. But when you've got just a bucket of water that's not moving, nothing's going to be regenerating it. So this is what's happening with the decomposition of the weeds and algae. As the plants die, they are broken down. As they're broken down, it takes oxygen. So you end up crashing the entire ecosystem. Everything literally suffocates, which is not pleasant. So this is what ends up happening. This is an example of the 2014 dead zone. So this is a little old now. I should probably look up more recent ones. Oxygen-deprived water. So this is at the end of the Mississippi River where it opens up near New Orleans, down in the Gulf of Mexico. There is a giant swath of the Gulf of Mexico every year when the fertilizer stops coming, the algae dies, and there's just a giant dead zone. There's nothing there. Anything that swims into that area, fish swims in, and it's like there's no air. They're in space, basically. Right? Gills are working, nothing comes in. If there's no animals there at all. There's some plants, but they're all dying, which is what creates this. So it turns into this giant dead zone, which is not ideal, to put it mildly. Not ideal at all. So this is what we mean when we say that things are complicated. Creating fertilizer was probably one of the greatest achievements that we've managed to do because it allows us to grow food to the scale that we can. I mean, Canada is a net exporter of food. We grow a lot of food. It's cold here. That's impressive. And it's important. I mean, we need to eat. We're top predators. We use a lot of resources. But killing all the marine life, it's a bit of a problem. The human impact. Oh boy. The cycling of nitrogen can be disturbed by human activities. I think you can see that already. Agriculture, of course, is a big one. Livestock operations especially produce a large amount of animal feces, aka manure, aka poop. The disposal of manure is monitored so that large amounts are not washed into rivers in the form of runoff and into lakes and rivers, etc. during the spring snowmelt. This is a big problem in Manitoba especially. We're pretty flat here, in case you haven't noticed. So we don't necessarily get a lot of runoff from rain, but we do in the spring because the ground is still frozen, so it can't absorb the water, so the water just slides along the ground. So in the spring, when the snow melts, if there's a bunch of poop just lying out on the field, it'll get washed into the rivers. Huge nitrate spike kickstarts the production of algae and stuff. Big problem. So that's our first one, right? So it's mostly from animal farming. Okay? 2, leaching. In places that are less flat, soil may erode and fertilizers may wash off of farmland. So as you can see here in the picture, right, this has got more of a rolling hills kind of thing. So this would be like if you go east or west of here where you start to get more hills. The ammonia and nitrates can also seep into groundwater. Remember I said that originally, right, like the ground is frozen, can't absorb the water, so it just like washes all the poop into the river. I mean, where did you think it went, right? Well, unfortunately, even if the ground is not frozen, it's still not great because what happens? The water sits on top, dissolves the poop, and then it sort of soaks into the ground and takes the poop with you. I know, kind of, but what are we going to do? It's got to go somewhere. Now, normally it goes somewhere and then gets broken down by bacteria. The problem is when it ends up in lakes and rivers and other things, which is an issue. It turns out that ingesting nitrates from well water can cause children a blood disorder called anemia, which I believe is a blood disorder that means that you can't easily clot. I think it means you bleed a lot. I'd have to check. Point is, if it's sliding across the surface or digging into the ground, it's not a good thing. This is the reason why we have to filter and process water. Now, it's like, wait, what? You mean previously we didn't have to? Well, okay, we kind of always needed to get clean water. The difference is that now we understand that better. Previously, we just kind of drank poop water directly because we didn't understand that was bad. The germ theory of disease. It was discovered in England at the turn of the last century, and they discovered that people who lived in London were basically using water pumps to get water from the river. But they would have, like, here, a place that produces sewage. So, like, the sewer would just put poop in the river. And then downriver, so the water's flowing towards the pump, you'd pick up the water and people would go use it to two things. Not everywhere had that. Some places had the opposite, where they had the water intake upriver from the sewage. And what they discovered over a bunch of experiments was that, wow, people who drink water filled with poop get sick. Maybe we should stop doing that. I know, you're like, really? For a long time, people thought that you got sick because things smelled bad. They didn't realize that it was bacteria and viruses. So they didn't understand the importance of washing your hands. They didn't understand the importance of not drinking poop water. Now, to be clear, when I say poop water, I don't mean that it's like super obviously smelly and stuff. I mean that even a little bit can cause various things, especially cholera. It's a big one, and it's caused by a bacteria that ends up getting in your digestive tract and makes you have a really not so great time. So the water would mostly look clean. It's just there'd be bacteria growing in it that they couldn't see. This is the reason why we, of course, treat our water and we process it beforehand. In the old days, they would have suggested you boil it, or they also did a lot of drinking of alcohol because the process of making alcohol kills bacteria. So in the old days, people used to drink way more alcohol than they do now because it was kind of the only safe water to drink at times. I know, the past is a strange place and sometimes filled with weirdness. All right. Moving on from leaching, septic fields and holding tanks. Oh, never mind. We're back in the same topic. Leakage and releasing wastewater and sewage into the ground causes this kind of problem. These materials can seep into the earth, enter groundwater, and into people's drinking water. As mentioned, that's bad. The basic idea is like in a city, right, we have an internal plumbing network in the city that collects the sewage when you flush the toilet, takes it to a sewage processing plant where it is basically put through all the processes that would happen in nature, but like a lot faster and in a contained space in order to make sure the water that comes out is not dirty anymore, right? Basically we get a bunch of like, it's not just filters, it's literally the same process that we would use to clean it in nature. We've got the bacteria breaking things down, turning things from one to the other, all that kind of stuff. If you live out in a farm, you don't have that. So instead what you have to do is rely on the natural process. So when they flush their toilet, it'll go out into a tank of some form, which may have a truck come around and basically take a giant vacuum and stick it down in the hole and suck everything up into the truck and then take it away to the plant. That costs you some money, of course. Also, it's a job I'm happy I'm not doing. Or that tank can be connected to a field where basically the sewage is spread out across the field and the field is properly prepared, if it's done right, to basically act like a mini filtration system. So it helps to filter, and it's got all the bacteria there and everything. It helps to break it down. So the idea is that by the time it comes out the bottom of this, it'll be clean. But if it was built improperly or not built at all, and you're being super lazy and just assuming that it won't be a problem because you're just going to throw poop out, then this is an issue because it releases nitrates into the groundwater, into the soil, and all the rest of it. The real big problem is when you end up with like, a well right next to the septic tank because these are on the same water table. But again, when it's done properly, it's okay. We've had to deal with this issue for a long time. But that doesn't mean that sometimes people don't take shortcuts. Number 4, waste treatment plant. We talked about this one already. Manufacture malfunctions can occur, releasing raw sewage into lakes and rivers. A heavy rainstorm may overwhelm the capacity of the treatment plant, requiring the release of a partially treated wastewater into the lake or river. So what you see here is that generally the city will do a good job of maintaining everything, but sometimes they won't. When I lived in Halifax, they had a problem where their sewage treatment plant was broken. So for 6 months, they just pumped raw sewage into the harbor of Halifax. That was not pleasant. Here, right, you can see there's tons of different steps and different features here. Like down here, we got the bioreactors. It says this is what's producing. This is the bacteria breaking things down. You got multiple stages here of clarifiers, they're called. These are basically separating out the different parts in order to make it easier. You got fermenters, which again, that's where you're doing fermentation in order to transform through biological processes to clean everything up and stuff. Anaerobic digesters, again, same thing. All of these are basically big containers filled with living organisms, bacteria that are breaking this stuff down in exactly the way they would in nature, but here they just get to do it really, really fast because we like making the ideal environment for them to live, giving them tons and tons of food all the time. So it works great. This is an example, again, of us taking understanding of the natural world in order to employ it to make a problem less of a problem. In the old days, when there were not nearly so many people around, people still had to poop, but they knew that they could use that for fertilizer. They figured that one out. Took a bit, but they did. But they also just realized that they could just, keep it far away from the settlement, from the city, from the village or whatever. And eventually it seems to just go away on its own. Well, that's because the natural processes were breaking it down. And it worked fine because there weren't that many people. So we weren't making as much waste. But there are a lot of people now. So now we need to speed up the process. So these are the ways in which humans can impact the nitrogen cycle. Okay, and so we saw what the nitrogen cycle is. We saw the problems that come as a result of managing nitrate levels in agriculture. And we've seen now the ways in which the nitrogen cycle can be disrupted by humans. There are 4 basic ways. And that's it. That basically covers the nitrogen cycle. So it's time for some practice. If you take a look, you've got some questions. You can work through them. And once you're done with that, take a look at some bioaccumulation. But that'll be next time. And I'll see you guys then.